Alright, how's it going, everybody? Recently, I got a chance to do something I've been wanting to do for a while now, and that is head on out towards the Columbia River Gorge and check out some of the waterfalls out there. And the other day, I got a chance to go to this one called La Tourelle Falls, and it's just right off 84 there. It's really easy to get to, so that was nice. And going on a weekday, I kind of had the whole place to myself, which was even better because not only is it a beautiful waterfall, and the Columbia River Gorge is gorgeous and just an amazing place to go admire God's creation. Yeah, and it's pretty awesome just for that alone. But I was excited to go to this one particular waterfall, specifically because I've been wanting to find a place where I could go and see some of this columnar basalt, which is all over the Columbia River Gorge and all over eastern Washington, actually. And I've honestly been sort of intrigued by this whole subject of the columnar basalt ever since I did a video on it. I don't know how many years ago now. I'm not even sure if it's been taken down or not, but I did a video however many years back, kind of when there was this big surge of people who were getting into this idea of the giant trees, the ancient giant trees. This idea of there being ancient giant trees that were like something out of Avatar, and the Devil's Tower in Wyoming being sort of the focal point of this whole theory because it looks like a tree stump and all that. So I did cover that and explain why I do not believe that these are giant trees and stuff. But nevertheless, I've been sort of fascinated by this whole phenomenon ever since. And, kind of had this curiosity bug planted ever since. And I think the topic is really interesting for probably at least three main reasons. The first being the most obvious, that, just the shape. These geometric patterns that formed, and they can have anywhere from like 3 to 7 or 8 sides or 9 sides or something like that. And they vary in size, and they vary in... Some of them are completely vertical. That's called a colonnade. When you have a layer of the columnar basalt that's like perfectly up and down. And some of them are very uniform, and sometimes they're not, and much more varied in size and shape. And then you also get this one that's called the entablature, which is more where they're kind of different. It's more irregular, and they bend and do all these kinds of motions, which I think is what sort of feeds into the idea that, yeah, it looks like an organic, natural growing, especially in Devil's Tower, where the bends kind of form the shape of the tree trunk, so it looks like individual, giant petrified bands of wood or something like that. It kind of gives that impression. But the more you really look into it and examine it, I think you have to abandon that whole idea pretty quickly. The more you really look at how much, because that's the second most interesting thing about this, is just how much of this stuff actually exists around the world. And even when you're watching most presentations or things on it, they'll mention the handful of well-known sites like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. Right, everyone's heard of that. And Devil's Tower. And then maybe, they'll mention Oregon and the Gorge and stuff. But when you really look into this, it's not just like, it's in a handful of places around the world. It's in probably more countries than it isn't. I don't know. I mean, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it's literally like not just in Ireland and Scotland, but up in Iceland. You have these magnificent columnar basalt cliffs by this river. It's in Portugal. It's in Spain, the Canary Islands. It's in Turkey. It's in Israel. You can find it in India, you can find it in Africa, you can find it in Antarctica, I believe. It's in Australia. There's this place called the San Rocks. And then a totally different place down in Victoria. So in 2 different states of Australia, they have this stuff. And of course, it's not, and not in places that are like really regarded as volcanic hotspots, at least in the modern sense. Can't remember if New Zealand has, I'm sure New Zealand has some, but it's in the South Pacific. There's actually it's like a megalithic structure that I'd never even heard of, that I stumbled across when I was looking into this topic over the last however many months. This whole temple complex that's been abandoned and was built however many years ago, and they made it all out of this columnar basalt. They hauled it in from somewhere else. It's not from the site, so they basically built an artificial island out of this stuff, and this is where like the priest class or the king, of these tribes, however long ago, built all this stuff, and it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's not megalithic size compared to like, Baalbek or whatever, but still pretty amazing when you think about how many pieces they moved out here and built this. So that was pretty fascinating. But yeah, you'll find it in Indonesia. You'll find it in Japan. Where else? I've lost track of all the places I found it. Apparently it's in China. I couldn't find any like footage or mentions of it, but apparently it does, because I found this video of one of these landscaping sort of supply companies, because what they do is they take these basalt pillars and make them into fountains. And so this guy's actually selling that. He just got in a new shipment from China of these basalt columns, and the same thing is done here locally in the Northwest. If you go out, I don't know exactly where it is, but yes, you can buy these things. And they just harvest. That's how much of this is that they're not even like protected as like geological obscurities or anything. They're literally harvested and sold in a mine. They don't have mineral value. They just have aesthetic value. So there's this whole industry of selling these things for like modern looking natural art to make fountains and centerpieces and, in front of a hospital or whatever. So there's so much of this stuff that's just everywhere, all around the world. And then on top of that, the third really interesting thing is that, okay, if you look into it for like 5 minutes, then you'll kind of get the basic pat answer explanation of how it's lava and then it was formed, having something to do with like pressure and water, or it cooled over a long period of time and all this stuff. But it's pure theory, because it's never actually been observed firsthand anywhere in the world. And that's really interesting, right? Because we have all kinds of different volcanic activity that's gone on throughout the century, whether it's just old-fashioned eruptions, which you have native accounts going back thousands of years, and you have, mountains erupting in ancient Greece and burying people. And people have witnessed volcanic phenomenon like throughout human history. And then, of course, in the scientific era, we started to study it and classify it much more rigorously. But this has never been observed in any form, large or small. So whatever conditions created this bizarre cooling pattern has never been replicated that we know of since, we started keeping track of this. You can't even find anecdotal accounts from hundreds of years ago in newspaper, nothing. In fact, this whole theory about it cooling over many, many years, there wasn't even really a theory published on it until 1962. So there's really not even a lot of information about this phenomenon. It's kind of this weird, it's actually even difficult to look up, because they use so many different terms to describe different cultures and places. It's not always even referred to as columnar basalt. That's more the technical geological name. But yeah, I started getting really kind of nerdy about this. I just got more curious. But other than harvesting these things for like their aesthetic value and use as fountains, and also being tourist attractions obviously the touristy places aren't being harvested, so it's more like often some remote, boring place where nobody cares, right? Where it's being mined. But this stuff is everywhere, and yet we've never seen it actually form. Unlike you can go and see video footage of pillow lava forming under the ocean, or lava coming out of the Big Island on Hawaii and places like that, or up in Iceland. You can see these giant lava cracks. I mean, we have seen lava tubes form. We have seen all kinds of things over the past 100 years or less. But what they say is that these massive lava pools like oozed out of these cracks. It's a completely different type of lava, going back to the Pacific Northwest now. It's a completely different type of lava than the kind that comes out of like the cone volcanoes of like Mount Rainier and Mount Adams and Mount St. Helens and all this. And in the course of looking into the columnar basalt topic, I came across this guy who's has a bunch of videos and lectures. Actually, he's a professor of geology at the Central Washington University. I think his name is Tim Metzner or something like that. And oh man, so that was something I kind of wanted to like share and talk about, but even on its own. But it ties into the columnar basalt thing, because he does talk about that. But of course, he's coming from an evolutionary standpoint where everything is millions and billions of years old. So that, according to their model, They say that there's actually 300 separate layers of these lava flows, and they are layers, and you can see this, and you can see colonnade on top of entablature, and then there's even other layers of sediment in between. So it kind of destroys your whole continuous petrified wood or petrified giants type theories, which, you have to actually look into this if you even want to. If you want to argue for whatever your interpretation of this stuff is, then you can't just glance at a few photos. You actually have to really look at how many instances of this material can be found. And so, when you listen to this guy, of course he's saying it's all happening over millions of years and it's just very slow and gradual. But so much of the other stuff he talks about, because he also talks about the ice ages, and particularly, according to evolutionary theory, and he's talking about all these glacial, basically, phenomenon of what they imagine the ice age, where the whole Earth was covered in ice, like massive glaciers that extended from the poles around the globe, right? And then it warmed up again, and then these massive glaciers kind of melted and broke off, and then carved their way down through the North American continent and created all these moraines. They call them glacial moraines and things like that. And you can look and see where there's all this evidence of this type of stuff, where there's no glaciers, today or any time that humans have recorded them. But the thing I think is so fascinating about a lot of the topics he covers is, whether it's glacial erratics, which are these giant boulder stones that are just kind of scattered throughout North America and the plains. And then he talks about, all these evidence of giant floods, right, which they attribute to the Ice Age. But of course, biblically, when you just stop and go, okay, according to the Bible, we're looking at just a few thousand years versus millions of years, obviously, and we're looking at a singular, massive, cataclysmic flood event versus millions of years of sort of gradual cataclysmic things. But a massive singular worldwide event where not just the rain, where the windows of heavens were opened up and water just poured in, but the springs of the deep were opened up, so that's water coming up from below and flooding everything and covering everything with water. But also, I believe, the springs of the deep opening, I don't think we could assume that only refers to water coming from the deep, but as we all know, magma and volcanic stuff is coming up from the deep all the time. So I really don't know how you get away from the conclusion that this massive basalt lava flows that are all over the world and have never, even in places like Ireland, which nobody associates places like Ireland with volcanoes and volcanic activity and lava, like Hawaii. But it was all over the world, and that along with the water and the floods, and you would have had massive channels being carved during the flooding process, right? As it was filling up, as the rain's pouring down the hills and making giant channels and pouring into what then becomes an ocean that eventually just covers everything. And then you would have had massive pressure. And so I'm not hard set on, I don't have some super intricate explanation, I don't think, but for me it makes sense that if these lava flows were happening as this process of the flood and the covering up with this massive worldwide ocean, these lava flows are going beneath the surface of the water, at least for I think a lot of it, and then you have all this massive pressure and you have massive cooling. And so rather than, they claim that these things would have taken even 100 years for the whole thing to cool down and solidify, which doesn't even make sense to me because of just the conductivity of air. And, once the lava's out, not down deep beneath the earth where it's all being constantly heated, however that works in reality, there's no core of magma to the ball. But it stays hot underground, and once it comes out, it cools very quickly. The idea that heat would just stay trapped inside, and that it was just this bizarre, gradual process of cooling that created these columns and this geometric effect, I think the reality is probably more on the opposite end, to where it was just massive amounts of pressure and cooling from just an ocean of water on top of it that compressed it somehow and cooled it super quick. I don't know. I kind of imagine it to be more of that kind of a process, but who's to say? And then you have all this variation, which also is fascinating. And then even Devil's Tower, it's okay, maybe their explanation of that, it was I forget what they call it. They have some geological term for when the magma pokes up It's like it pushed up from a hot spot underneath, which do exist, and forced up this basalt lava with like a mountain of dirt around it. But then again, if that's happening like as the world is flooding, and then maybe it just kind of punched up through and then hardened that way. It's a very weird thing because it didn't like get a chance to flow out all over the valley. It just kind of like poked up and then stopped. So it's almost like it got corked, I think. And then whatever conditions that created this columnar basalt all over the world did it here. But yeah, it's interesting stuff because some of it almost looks like hand sawn, and it has this ringing tone to it, and it's amazing. And other stuff is just very kind of irregular, and you can almost barely even discern the columns at all. So yeah, there's a lot of mystery to it still, but I think I can't get away from the fact that, in my mind, almost certainly evidence that this was all created around a similar time in conjunction with the flood. And then, of course, if you think about all this stuff being formed, not over a series of millions of years, but of, at the most, a handful of years or a few generations, but possibly even just within, like, days and months. Just this cataclysmic time. Even, let's say all these volcanic basalt flows were just going on while the world is being flooded, and then it was all covered up and condensed and cooled and created all this stuff. And then, of course, a lot of it, as everything melted, or as everything drained, is basically as the world drained out, a lot of it too would have been then buried by other silt and other material, which a lot of it is buried. It's weird how so many of the places where you can actually see it are where, the sides of the cliffs and things, such as in the gorge, where it's been eroded by water or the ocean, like in Giant's Causeway. But then there are places too, like Australia, where it's just out in the open. I don't think it's next to a river or anything. It would be interesting it would be very difficult, but if you could get like an average of the altitude of all this stuff, like the average, it seems like a lot of it's pretty close to sea level, but I don't know. But yeah, the whole idea that, especially when you look at these diagrams that Metzner shows, where it's like this big pool. He calls it the German chocolate cake because it has all these layers, but it's like it pooled up, it came out in central Washington and kind of pooled up and followed basically what was already a river channel there. Of course, he's talking millions of years ago, but I'm just talking like pre-flood. You have to basically translate everything from like the evolutionary nonsense timeline with the dinosaurs and then the Ice Age. You just translate it all to the flood, basically. But you can definitely see how it all pooled here, and then it flowed out to the ocean. And then actually, this basalt, supposedly there's like this giant deposit of basalt underneath the ocean. But not all the basalt cooled into these columns either. So that's another interesting thing, is that sometimes it did, and sometimes it just kind of was this blobby basalt mass of rock. So the question is, what conditions could really create this effect? But how ironic would that be if they've been selling these stone pieces to just decorate shopping malls and office buildings and things, if in reality they're just little evidences of the flood and the truth of God's word right in front of everyone, and we're just, just like so many other things, completely oblivious and ignoring the evidences of God and his creation and the truth of Genesis and so many things. So if anybody's kind of nerdy about this stuff like me, then feel free to go watch some of these lectures. I think one of the things as I was listening to it just kind of in general and jumping around was kind of the realization that this whole concept of the Ice Age, right, with these giant glaciers that cover the earth for thousands of years at a time, or at least hundreds, but from when you really go back and think about the biblical flood covering the whole world, even on a globe, okay, with that much extra water, think about how thick the ice caps would get, even if they didn't expand out over the whole earth. And now in enclosed cosmology, obviously it's the same thing. You have the center Arctic region and the outer Antarctic region, but either way. And I think it makes far more sense to have everything the Bible says about the flood in this enclosed system than this goofiness. But even so, you kind of stop and realize that just with the ice caps being super thick, think about several miles thick, like in the middle of the pond, so to speak, and then the pond goes down and then it starts to melt and chunks break off and they'd be floating out outward, I would think, and yeah, eventually as the waters are moving down and basically going down back into the deep, down through channels that who knows how that works or where they are, but the water drained. And then that movement would have pulled all this ice outward across the land, and it would have eventually sat and carved these glacial moraines and carved up the landscape, and made little ice dams for a while and redirected water. It would have been the landscape would have just been massively kind of sculpted in that first year or few years, where all that ice, probably did take a good while for some of those massive chunks of ice to melt, but there was no humans there for however long after. And of course, that kind of ties into the whole Pangea, Peleg topic and idea, which is still fascinating to me. So all these things kind of happening, right, where you had volcanic alteration of the landscape, massive amounts of water filling and draining, altering the landscape, ice altering the landscape, and then continental drift altering the landscape. And again, potentially in a much faster and more dramatic fashion than, of course, evolution imagines anything to happen. So I just like looking at this stuff and kind of looking into it and learning about new things that I didn't know about, and just kind of marveling at the creation and at how. I mean, there's just so much stuff in the Northwest. When you look at, if you've ever been to the Columbia River, especially when you get up towards Grand Coulee Dam, and this whole area, it's just an awesome. I mean, you can literally kind of, just like the Grand Canyon, if you've ever seen that, and you can just imagine massive amounts of water flowing through it, like bigger than any river that exists today. Where like the whole, imagine the whole Midwest of the United States just basically being a giant sea, a giant lake that it took however long to drain out down through the Southwest. And the crazy thing is like, this Metzner guy, he actually acknowledges a lot of examples like this, that these are examples of floods, right? But he's interpreting it as all these ice age floods, right? That were just kind of, they didn't cover the whole earth or anything. They were localized and blah, blah, blah. But there was so many of them, and, they were still big enough that it left all these signs of I mean, there's like water lines, places where, water's never been. And you can see, he talks about it, like, these are the Ice Age floods. So, I think there's a whole video on the Ice Age floods that he talks about it. But if you watch it, and you look, because he goes, what's cool is that he does kind of show you, he always takes it out of just the diagrams, and he goes to local spots and shows you, features and things. And then you're like, when you see it through the lens of the flood, it's like everything you see, it makes perfect sense to me. But of course, it's just not millions of years. So yeah, I'll leave some links below. And if you guys have come across any interesting info nuggets about geology or the flood or columnar basalt, whatever, just weird stuff, definitely throw those in the comments. And I've kind of been just randomly revisiting this here and there when I just wanted to completely step away from Antifa craziness or whatever else. Lockdown, I just kind of overload. And this is the kind of stuff I really do enjoy. It's more my speed. It's talking about things. It's not millions of years ago, but it's still thousands of years ago. And it's just amazing to think about. That's kind of like how now I'll never look at the sky the same way, or the stars, or the sun and the moon. And everything just feels so much more like up close and personal and intentional and real, tangible, even though I guess that's kind of ironic. The stars, it's less tangible in the sense that you're not like, oh yeah, we could go walk on that moon, or we could go fly to that star someday. It's not like that, but it's all here for us, and it's all real, and it's all history, past and present, all right in front of your face. And in geology, just like a lot of topics that I kind of never thought of before, like astronomy or physics and things, but looking at it through the lens of creation and from the lens of just taking the Bible at its word and not trying to filter it through supposedly all these things that science has already determined. Yeah, so much of the time you realize that science is just kind of, their explanations for things are just really flimsy and even contradictory and very just not that satisfying at all. So I find the Bible and its explanation to be much more satisfying than billions and millions of years. Knowing that we were created with intention and with a purpose, and that all of history is in the hands of God. Yeah, when you just think about things like the flood And you think about how much power that took giant boulders and moved them hundreds of miles, across the landscape like pebbles in a stream. It's almost unimaginable. We've never seen anything that comes close to what the flood was. And that's the thing. So like, if these basalt columns were, if it's true that that's when they were formed, it was during this cataclysmic flood, when like everybody but Noah and his family, they were the only ones who survived. So obviously you wouldn't have any eyewitnesses to how this stuff formed. Noah would have gotten out of the ark, and they began to spread out and repopulate, and then they decide to disobey and go build the Tower of Babel, and so God puts a stop to that. But yeah, it would have just kind of been all over the place, and like I said, most of it's buried. Like this one in Iceland, they didn't even know it existed until just recently, because they dammed up the river or dropped it or something. It was all underwater. They didn't even know this was here. So, or at least most of it. There was more that was underwater. So, very peculiar, very interesting. But yeah, I think it's from the flood. Something about the flood, whether it was the pressure or the temperatures, and maybe that explains why you would have different layers of this stuff. Like sometimes right next to each other, where one layer is all vertical and another's all bendy and wonky with this entablature. Maybe the conditions of the water were very turbulent, and it's like, okay, even here this is interesting when you look at this formation here by the falls, where it does feel like it's, when you look at the contours of the bends in the basalt, it does kind of seem like it's all bending towards the middle of this, what would have been a ravine before it was all filled in with lava, right? Or like layers of it. And so I don't know if like the motion, like as it's cooling, like maybe if it was kind of motionless and it's just cools, maybe that's what created the vertical, the perfectly vertical columns. But if it was still kind of oozing along and bending with the topography, and then it hardens that way, I don't know. But it is interesting. It does seem like it kind of matches the landscape. It's not just curving off in some completely random direction. I don't know. But yeah, so I just kind of wanted to share my thoughts on that, and it's an ongoing curiosity, and ultimately just points us back to the greatness of God and the truth of His Word and the beauty of His creation and the hope we have in Him. So, thanks for watching. Thanks for letting me share that. God bless.